Well, good afternoon, everyone. You know you have a family table when everybody's catching up and seeing everyone. I welcome you all to CSIS. My name is Heather Conley. I direct the Europe program here at CSIS, and I always get this funny look of, you direct the Europe program, but you have an Arctic project. I like to call this extreme Northern Europe, but CSIS has been involved in a research project for the past 5 years, the Geopolitics of the High North project, which has just recently come to a conclusion, and now we are focusing our attention on the Russian Arctic and doing some study and research and analysis of that. So CSIS has been in the Arctic game for quite a while, and we are delighted to be able to have an opportunity to talk about the Arctic environment. And I don't know how we got so lucky to do this on Earth Day, so I can't imagine a better way to celebrate Earth Day than to talk about a place on the Earth that is changing quite dramatically. And if I had to choose 3 people that I'd want to talk to about these dramatic changes, I would talk to the following 3 people who are going to speak with us today. And beginning to my right with Dr. Kelly Falkner, who's Director of the Office of Polar Programs at the National Science Foundation. Kelly has been a real leading figure in driving the American science agenda in the Arctic and the Antarctic. We can't forget we are bipolar, which is always a bad joke when we talk about it. Prior to joining NSF, Dr. Falkner was professor in the College of Oceanic and Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State University. And she served from 2007 to 2009 at NSF in a new program. She created the program of Antarctic Integrated Science, System Science, and we are delighted that you could be with us, Dr. Falkner. And then as we'll start our conversation, we'll move down the table to Andreas Kraemer, who's director and CEO of the Ecologic Institute in Berlin, and is expanding his territory into the United States, and is the chairman of the Ecologic Institute in Washington, D.C. And I thought I read something that you are going into California. Am I correct with see the grand plan expands? Andreas has been the director of the Ecologic Institute since 1995 and is really one of the leading experts on transatlantic energy issues and policy. He's the person I turn to when I want to understand the German renewable energy strategy. But Andreas and I have been working together on something that we'll talk to you a little bit about, perhaps later in the discussion, about the Arctic Summer College. And we wanted to also use this opportunity to talk a little bit about that and what we're about there. And then further left is my ultimate partner in crime here in Washington, Bill Eichbaum, Vice President of Marine and Arctic Policy at the World Wildlife Fund. Bill has just been a stalwart on Arctic issues, governance issues, Arctic Council issues. He is so well known to the environmental community, working in a variety of programs at the state level, Massachusetts and Maryland, and WWF is very fortunate to have him aboard and shaping their Arctic policy. And CSIS and WWF have been making trouble the last couple of years on Arctic Council issues, and it's a joy and a pleasure to have Bill with us. So just before we turn to Kelly for some comments and turn to then Andreas and Bill, we really are breaking records in the Arctic. We're seeing where North Hemisphere snow cover is at declines of 10% since the late 1960s, increases in ocean acidification, loss of summer sea ice, 49% below average. We have coastal erosion, thinning or retreating permafrost, which has the potential to release massive amounts of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, commercial activity and potentially increase in ship pollution, We have potentially weakened Arctic oscillation. All of these issues are transforming the Arctic environment as we know it. And we want to talk about that transformation and the trends, and hopefully Kelly, Bill, and Andreas will help us understand that. But there's also been a lot of motion on the policy front here in the United States, and I commend to you the recent report to President Obama, Managing for the Future in a Rapidly Changing Arctic. The Department of Interior spurred report that I'm sure NSF had a lot of participation in. And it talks about an integrated Arctic management approach where science is part of shaping the future decision-making process. And it also mentions that the White House will be releasing a new national strategy for the Arctic, potentially before the Arctic Council Ministerial on May the 15th, to talk about those new strategic priorities and potentially streamlining the federal government's policy in the Arctic. I also commend to you a small study that CSIS just put out today publicly and talks about that streamlining, new organization, a new foreign policy frontier. It talks a little bit about the Arctic. So, and then of course next month, Arctic Council Ministerial, the showdown of permanent observers, Asia, non-Arctic, Arctic, oil spill response. So we have great environmental change, policy dynamic, global interests. All of this brings us to our conversation today. And with that, as my mother would say, I'll shush and turn this over to Dr. Kelly Falkner. Thank you again. And if you thought you were going to come to a North Korea conversation, that's in the room next door. So I just want to make sure we're all here to talk about the Arctic. Okay, we're good.
Okay. I hope everybody can hear me. Yes, good. Okay. So at the risk of insulting some of you who already know this, when I was thinking about what to tell an audience that I wasn't quite clear who would be here, I felt I should start with who the National Science Foundation is. Because as I get around Washington, I'll have people ask me questions about what does this private group fund and that sort of thing. But you should be aware the National Science Foundation is an independent federal agency created by Congress in 1950. And our mission is to promote the progress of science, to advance national health, prosperity, and welfare, and to secure the national defense. So we're primarily a grant-making agency, funding about 20% of all research at the nation's colleges and universities. We have a budget of about $7 billion, and all but 6% of that goes to supporting research. So my takeaway message from this brief remarks I'm going to make right now is, although conducted in places and on subjects seemingly remote, polar science matters to people everywhere. So the many reasons it matters motivates our rich portfolio that I'll describe for you a little bit right now. So I'd like to note that for the Arctic at NSF, we have a Arctic section that supports both research and logistics. We expend about $110 million annually on that, and about $40 million of that goes towards the logistics side of the house. So we support programs in Arctic natural science, social science, what we call system science, and also an observing network. So we've been supporting Arctic natural science and system science for over 20 years. The observing network end of things is a more recent effort and a little bit less mature. But as Heather was pointing out, the types of problems we're looking at in the Arctic right now are complex enough and integrated enough that our systems approach to science is extremely important to us. And obviously, observing networks would be key to any future progress of understanding that we're pushing to develop. Okay, so you know the change in the Arctic is substantial, and it's ongoing, and surprisingly rapid. So it's much more rapid than I expected when I started working over 20 years ago in Arctic oceanography, I'll tell you that. It's much more rapid than what we can find in analogs in the recent past, back to several thousand years at a minimum. And the pace of change may be unprecedented. So, and at the same time, as you know, there's growing interest in shipping and mineral and other natural resource exploitation. So the magnitude of these changes and the social and scientific issues they engender really do require systems thinking. And also, I'd note that it's beyond the scope of any individual nation. So in a time of tightly constrained resources and pressing needs, we view it as essential to collaborate widely, to leverage and not replicate efforts at a national and international level across state and federal agencies, with private partners, and very importantly with Arctic residents and native communities. So as a basic research agency, we realize we must be vigilant and support the research community to identify and fill in key knowledge gaps. So we do this in lots of ways, but what I would like to point out is that we recently kicked off a multi-agency study supported by the National Academy, and the title of that is Emerging Research Questions in the Arctic, and we expect to have the results of that within about a year. Also, I would like to point out that the National Science Foundation director chairs a committee called the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee. That committee oversees 14 agencies in an effort to coordinate research on Arctic issues across government. And they just recently, in February, released a 5-year plan that is available from the White House, because this is something that OSTP co-sponsors. So I'll have to be honest, this requirement for this plan has been in place since quite a while now, but it's come in fits and starts. I think the first approach to it, where government agencies sort of sat down and made a laundry list of all the things they were doing annually, and then maybe reported out on a bit of that. But this plan attempts to choose the highest priority areas that are best advanced by a coordinated agency approach, and not a laundry list. So there are 7 areas of interest that they've identified. These wouldn't be surprising, given what you're hearing about changes in the Arctic. They include sea ice and marine ecosystems as one category, terrestrial ice and ecosystems as another, surface heat, energy and mass balances, observing systems, regional climate models, adaptation tools for sustainability of communities, and human health. So, in order to address these things from a national science basic research perspective, we need to maintain what I like to call science domain awareness. We hear a lot about domain awareness from our security standpoint, but what I'm going to show you now, is just to give you a flavor for what the science domain awareness is. So this is a movie. So, whoops. I gotta go back. You help me there. Okay. What you're going to see now is what we support in the Arctic by ships, by aircraft, by surface means. What you're looking at are, in blue, are relatively permanent stations, or research hubs, we call them, that we maintain. It's a little hard to see in the full light here. But, and then each year will flash up in the left-hand corner, and that represents the places we are occupying for observations in a given year. The lines in the ocean represent icebreakers or research vessel tracks. And we support research vessels, both domestic and international, to conduct research that National Science Foundation sponsored researchers do. So I think in a moment here you're going to see the composite of the 5 years that will give you a flavor for just how, it looks like measles in the Arctic basically, broad a reach we have. Okay, so that's fantastic to be able to have the eyes and ears at all those places. There are stations that have automated sensors. There are places people work out of. But it's also a challenge because of the rising fuel and labor costs. So just at this point where we know we're seeing these changes and we need to redouble our efforts to keep our observations going and improve them, we've got a big challenge to deal with. So we actually have a research component to supporting our work. We need to avoid the rising cost of fuel diminishing our ability to support research. So we're looking very, whoops, I don't know why it's going. Let me go back. Right, at this slide here, it might be an automated time thing or something, shows several examples of us using renewables and alternative energy methods to support research. You're looking up at the Tower of Power at Summit Station in Greenland on the upper left. And that was a photovoltaic array that provides energy to support research at Summit Station. Down in the bottom, you see a group from the University of Alaska at Fairbanks who won a contest that Michigan Technical University sponsors for clean snowmobiles. At Summit Station, we're trying to look at background levels of pollutants in the atmosphere. So zooming around on snowmobiles that are emitting is not helping us. This student group won last year in a design that's a zero emissions machine that you see off to the right. And it's on its way to Greenland to use this season. So the other thing up in the corner is wind turbines that are down at McMurdo Station in Antarctica. So we take sort of a cross-polar approach, testing and using renewables in both places. We fund our remote field, we supply energy at our remote field sites through renewables in a lot of instances too. But this is absolutely essential. We need to be really clever and really innovative to be able to sustain the level of observations needed going forward. All right. So, wants to keep going. So what I'd like to do now is just take you through a couple of examples of what I think are some of the pressing issues that affect us all with respect to the changes in the Arctic. And what you're looking at here on the left is a depiction of our jet stream, which brings us our weather. So we know that the sea ice in the Arctic is retreating, and the question is, so what? What does that mean? Well, we funded a person named Jennifer Francis at the University of Rutgers, and she has been studying our changing weather patterns. And what basically, this is a reduction of much more complex matter, but basically what she's finding is that we are seeing patterns that are consistent with the fact that we've reduced the temperature gradient between the pole and our latitudes. When you do that, you change the waveform. You lengthen the waveform that the jet stream exemplified in that picture shows. That is moving our weather around. At the same time you lengthen that waveform, you slow the propagation. Rossby wave theory would predict that. And that's what she's seeing. If she looks empirically in time at our records of weather, it's consistent with this notion. And so the weather lingers longer, and it's more extreme because you're taking weather from higher and lower latitudes to places that it wasn't before. So there are a lot of questions this finding raises, and a lot of research needs to be done to really understand this. But there you go. Losing Arctic sea ice actually is going to change our weather in the US. Certainly it's changing it in Europe as well. And then the other thing is it's changing precipitation patterns. And that picture, two pictures off to the right, on the top is muskox and the other is caribou in Greenland. And we're finding, we call it phenology, and I'm sure my colleagues will talk a little bit more about this, but it's the timing of natural events and how they relate to each other. And those are changing dramatically. So in this case, these two animals, it turns out that the warming is causing earlier blossoming of some of the vegetation that's key to the young of both the muskox and the caribou. The caribou is still delivering its young at the same time, but the blossoms are gone by the time the young are being delivered. And so their population has taken a hit in this area in Greenland, whereas the muskox is doing better than it did before with its young. So there are a number of changes like this that are impacting certainly subsistence living styles throughout the Arctic, and that's just one example. The other thing you probably heard about was we had a spectacular melt on Greenland last year. There was melting at all altitudes and all over the ice sheet. And that's a pretty rare event. But basically, what you're looking at in this picture is time, July 8th, 12th, 22nd, and 29th. When it's all orange, it means that melt was seen by the NASA satellites over the entire area, both on the 12th and again on the 29th. You're seeing that. So that last happened, as far as we can tell, in 1889. And interestingly enough, we had a project up there at the same time, which is looking at the effect of aerosols and clouds and so forth on weather in the Arctic. And what you're looking at there is a kind of interesting atmospheric phenomena at Summit Station, where you have a refraction in the atmosphere giving you those beautiful, it's hard to see in this room, but they are actually beautiful rainbow patterns. But it turns out they also observed a large amount of what we call liquid water cloud over the same time frame we saw the melting. That lets sunlight come through because it's transparent to the incoming radiation, but liquid water is a very strong greenhouse gas and trapped a lot of the heat and led to that melting event. So, and that, of course, is contributing to sea level rise, and that is an accelerating contribution. We know now that the contribution from land ice is now growing, both from Antarctica, from Greenland, and also from the other smaller ice caps around the world. And that the rate at which it's growing seems to be increasing. This last slide is just to illustrate, as Heather had mentioned, that we're concerned about the amount of carbon that's vulnerable to release in the atmosphere. The amount of carbon in the tundra that's now, and permafrost that's thawing, is equal to more than twice what our atmosphere currently holds. So it's very important how quickly this carbon becomes released into the atmosphere. There are many competing factors that can cause the Arctic to be a sink for carbon or a source for carbon to the atmospheres. So for example, we know the Arctic is greening. Since 1980, we've seen 20% greater land area green by plants in the Arctic. On the other hand, it's also been a source of increasing fire, and that would be a sink to the atmosphere for carbon. So we are still trying to gain a handle on the balancing factor, and there are many of them that affect carbon. What you're looking at there is just along the riverbank, and that is impressive thickness of tundra in the Russian Arctic. So I'm going to leave it there and say, you know, there are probably at least 50 more wonderful findings that our scientists have made that I could talk to you about. But the important thing to remember is that it's not just isolated to effects on the Arctic itself, that it really is affecting all of us. So your interest and your attention to this issue is very important at this point in time.
Thank you, Heather. You asked why or how did it come that on Earth Day we are celebrating this with an Arctic issue, and I have the answer to that question, and it has something to do with the Ecologic Institute, and I strategically positioned myself in front of that roll up there. Yep. We are celebrating this week the 5th anniversary of the incorporation, the founding of Ecologic Institute in Washington, D.C., which is a 501c3 non-profit public charity under the laws of the District of Columbia, which now has an office also in California. That's true, and actually all the staff members of the California office are here in the room today. There are only 2 of them. So it's not that we are really covering the whole planet with our activities. No, Ecologic Institute was originally established in 1995, and we had a transatlantic program ever since the inception, and over time it grew, and we suddenly felt that we needed to have colleagues who could actually operate on this side of the Atlantic, not only inside the Beltway, inside the Washington Beltway, understanding how the policy developments in the United States work and report to about that to their colleagues on the European side. But we also felt that the Institute could serve a purpose by explaining what is going on in Europe to audiences in the United States that wanted to know, to explain what works, what doesn't work, and in that sense help align policies, avoid misunderstandings, and whatever else needs to be done. As part of that process, we've been working on Arctic issues for a few years now. You can go to our website and you find an Arctic program there. The establishment of which coincided with an important constitutional development on the European side. And I wanted to start with that point, because why is the European Union suddenly interested in the Arctic? It needs an explanation. The answer is, in my view, and you hear different theories about that, but in my view, what is important is that we had the constitutional development that allowed the gradual build-up of a European common foreign and securities policy. We now have the entry into force at the end of 2009 of the Lisbon Treaty, which really changed the distribution of competences between the member states and the European Union, and also led not only to changes in the constitution, but also in the institutional alignments, in the way the government is organized at the European level, with the intention of actually developing a pan-European, European Union external action service, a sort of State Department diplomacy service. Charles de Gaulle once said you can't make an omelette of hard-boiled eggs. And if you look at the diplomacies of the member states, they're definitely hard-boiled eggs. They don't want to be scrambled. But that is in essence what the European Union wants to do. It wants to align the foreign policies and the actions of the diplomacies, the diplomatic services of their member states, and bring that into a new institutional setting at the European level, against all the resistance, bureaucratic resistance, everything that history tells you about the role of the nation state. It's going to be a monumental task that's going to take 2 generations. I think that we will succeed not earlier than the last person who now enters the foreign service in any one of the member states leaves the service. That's the earliest time when it can be achieved. So it's a monumental task, but one of the ways in which it is done is that the European Union starts processing issues that are evidently necessarily European, that they cannot be dealt with purely at the member state level, and formulating a response to the challenges, the changing environment in the Arctic, the new opportunities, but also the new threat scenarios, the new destabilization that can happen there. That is one of those things that the European Commission at the time decided to develop as one of the areas in which a pan-European response should be formulated. And it's really, you don't build new bureaucratic structures, new administrative structures in a vacuum, in the abstract. You do it by processing concrete issues, and the Arctic is one of those issues. So that's no coincidence that 2007 was the agreement on the Lisbon Treaty, 2008 saw the first publication of a comprehensive Arctic policy document from the European Commission, but also activities in the European Parliament, and now since 2009 we have the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty. So in a way that explains why there is this interest, why there is this dynamic, why the European Union is interested in investing in there. It is in part driven by the same interests that drive the development of Arctic policies in member states. But in addition to that, there is also an institutional or bureaucratic dynamic, if you like, that I have just described. What are the purposes of European policy? A, to do something that's new. B, to deal with the challenges of bringing about policy cohesion. All the member states that had interest in the Arctic had Arctic policies, but none of them had a comprehensive Arctic policy. Some of them were interested in maritime issues, others interested in security issues, third in fisheries. They had different aspects there. The Arctic countries inside the European Union or inside the European Economic Area, they of course had populations living in the Arctic. They had coastal state rights, or still have them. So they had a very different way of approaching the Arctic than let's say Germany, which has one of the largest container fleets, if not the largest container fleets in the world, and therefore a shipping interest in the Arctic, but obviously no territorial aspirations in that area. So policy coherence and bringing that together coordinating not only across policies but also across member states to do something. That's the answer. And you invited me to talk about the Arctic Summer College, which is the thing we are launching here today. The Arctic Summer College started the first time in 2011, so this is the third iteration of it. We did that spontaneously when we had all our projects on the Arctic were finished, and many of the young researchers, they were still sitting on unfinished manuscripts, and really we wanted to provide a context for them to come together on a regular basis, exchange ideas, criticize one another's works, expand one another's horizons, get external speakers to give them new ideas, explain current developments to them or whatever. So in the first year, it was very much a spontaneous, self-organized activity by about a dozen young people who did that, supported by Ecologic Institute. And I remember halfway through that process, word got out, and a colleague from CSIS actually called us and asked us whether you could join. And we were not prepared for that question, but we never forgot it anyway. So the subsequent year, we set up a website. We set up the infrastructure to do this as the only college that works simultaneously in the whole circumpolar region, in all the time zones at the same time. It's all web-based. So there is a lot of process innovation that had to take place so that it could happen. And last year we got a very good program, which you can see on the website. And we developed it to the point that we have the moderation skills, which are very different if you do this via the web and things like that. All that was developed. And this year we now launched it. We are launching it here today again with CSIS, who has now become an institutional partner in this. And you find, if you scroll down, you actually see the CSIS logo somewhere there. And we are very grateful that, there you are, there you are. So it's great, Heather, to have this partnership and to have you host the launch event this year. But there are also two other organizations that I mentioned there. One, Bill Eichbaum. WWF's Global Arctic Program has been a partner in the earlier years already, and this year is also a financial sponsor, our first financial sponsor. So it's no longer Ecologic Institute carrying it all, but thank you very much for that partnership. And IUCN Martha, you're there, also joined as an institutional partner, as did the Canadian Embassy in Berlin. Not the government of Canada as a whole, it's just the Canadian Embassy in Berlin, but nevertheless it builds on a long-term partnership. The idea really is every year to build this up a little bit more and to offer more, to develop the technology, to develop a repository of documents that the researchers can do. We expect the first publications to come out of the Arctic Summer College this year, so that will give it visibility in the science community. It is very well respected and accepted in the policy community already. Being a small organization, it has attracted very high-level participants. And we expect that with the launch of the call for applications, which will happen today, so it will go up on the website, hopefully today. If it doesn't work, it will go up tomorrow, but it will go up. And then we will have the next iteration of this on the way to building this up as an institution that actually helps create a community of scholars who are, have no problem in thinking in global terms, cooperating with colleagues in different time zones, with different language backgrounds, with different disciplines that they come from. And we also feel that it's very important to have people who understand the complexity of all these issues and how they're interlinked. It's one thing to have good fisheries biologists who understand the dynamics of fish populations and can imagine what happens when the migration patterns change and populations that were separate in the past may interact and what that does to potential catches. But these people should also understand what happens in the environment, whether there are mega projects that pollute, whether there are shipping activities that are changing migration patterns, whether there are risks involved in there somewhere. What does it mean for the rights of indigenous peoples? How does their life change over time? What is the changing in the communities, the indigenous communities, vis-a-vis the resident communities of non-indigenous peoples? There are also a lot of social science issues that need to be dealt with. We want to bring people together who understand more than just the subject matter of their dissertation, but who are actually part of a college, and they see also the other issues that need to be dealt with and can put their own work in context. That's the vision that we want to go to. And thank you very much, both Bill and Heather, for your partnership here. Thank you.
Thank you. The governance issues that are evolving in the Arctic. And there are two reasons that I want to do that. One is I think that this is a area that offers extraordinary opportunity actually for intellectual analysis and development as it goes forward. So it relates to the intellectual, if you will, aspirations of the college. But it's also a set of issues that are growing in critical importance, as everyone probably is aware, because of the changes that are taking place in the Arctic, which provide a much different setting than has been the case for millennia. So we have two major things happening in the Arctic, at least, to put it in a simple frame. One is that the Arctic is becoming more accessible as the ice melts, and to some extent, a little bit more hospitable, although that can be debated as perhaps weather actually gets worse, even though there's less ice. But the other thing that's happening, and that's been alluded to, is that the ever growing demand for resources from the economic forces of our society is now looking to the Arctic because it is accessible, and there's a lot of stuff up there. At least potentially, there's thought to be a lot of stuff, whether it's hydrocarbons, whether it's the opportunity for quicker shipping and access via shipping of the resources that are in the Arctic, out of the Arctic, again, hydrocarbons and hard rock minerals. So there is this simultaneous access and demand happening. This is a region which is largely characterized by sovereign nations, 8 of them, who, through their territories, their territorial seas, and their EEZs, largely have the right to exercise sovereign authority, with a decreasing amount of that as you go out through the EEZ and the extended continental shelf. But there is a high seas area, which actually today is about 40% accessible during the summer, and in which there's no regime of governance. But there really is not much of a mechanism for these 8 countries to begin to come together to cooperate in the face of this change, in the face of this demand for resources that is going on. Unrelated to those 2 factors, in the mid-90s, the 8 countries did agree, pursuant to something called the Ottawa Declaration, to create the Arctic Council, an idea that was really stimulated by Gorbachev. And the Arctic Council has had a process of meeting, engaging government experts, non-government experts, examining critical problems in the region, doing very technical reports. There are people in the room, one of whom is 2 to my left, who's taking notes furiously as I describe his life's work, or at least a small piece of it. But the Arctic Council's recommendations and reports, in my view, and in the view of many, historically were pretty well ignored by the governments. Very good scholarship, often very solid recommendations, but rarely much clear uptake by the governments, and rarely much effort at accountability for implementation. That all began to change in the last several years. The WWF actually took the position that there ought to be a new treaty, not like the Antarctic system, but perhaps like a regional seas arrangement, such as the United States is party to in the Caribbean. But treaty, no, that was not possible. So, but we learned our lesson and we gave up on that idea as the governments were beginning to feel, I think, that they really did need to use the vehicle of the Arctic Council to begin to address shared problems in a collaborative way, perhaps with greater transparency, greater accountability, and greater effectiveness at implementation. So this new experiment in using the Arctic Council really popped to the fore, I would say, at the May 2011 ministerial meeting in Nuuk, Greenland, which for the first time a Secretary of State of the United States attended. Not only did Hillary Clinton attend, but lo and behold, the Secretary of the Interior, Ken Salazar, also went along, invited himself, in fact, I'm told. So there was suddenly this emerging interest by the United States, but even more interestingly, or stronger interest, was at the Nuuk Ministerial. First of all, the 8 countries signed a legally binding agreement on search and rescue. Never had been done before under the auspices of the Arctic Council. And they also decided that they would try to negotiate some sort of a new legal agreement that would address the issue of responding to oil spills. They also decided they needed to perhaps develop some under or overarching or underlying principles for shared thinking about the governance of the Arctic. That was ecosystem-based management, so work groups were set up to work on that. And there are several other issues, black carbon, so-called, that, that attention was addressed to. So for the first time at Nuuk, you had some legally binding agreements under the auspices of a non-legally binding agreement, the Ottawa Declaration. You had a commitment to move forward in new areas. You had the big oil and gas response and also prevention of spill, separate process. And you had this idea of trying to carve out a basis of ecosystem management. So the working group started working. Of course, the first thing that they did was they didn't allow NGOs to participate in their process, by and large, which we thought was a step back from where they'd been. There are permanent participants in the Arctic Councils, which are the indigenous people of the area. Some NGOs, such as IUCN and WWF, have observer status, but to our surprise, we were actually excluded from the initial meetings of some of these processes. That was quickly reversed, so this became a much more transparent, a much more participatory process, and the United States really provided a lot of leadership in that regard. So during this 2-year period, since May, and now looking at next month, at the next ministerial meeting in Kiruna, there has been progress. There have been real results. There is a proposed agreement on responding to oil spill. There are proposed principles and practices for ecosystem-based management. There are indications of next steps to be taken in that area, and this has been repeated. At the same time, at Nuuk, the decision was made to create a permanent secretariat for the Arctic Council and to actually provide for some permanent funding or committed funding for that. So that begins to build an institution, which is, of course, why the states were opposed to it for many years, but they decided that wasn't adequate going forward. They did need some official institutional capacity to manage processes. So what we see happening is that the Arctic Council, in a very consensual process of the governments, is identifying priorities, addressing them, and beginning to come up with greater specificity of action than they have in the past, some of it legally binding, as they look towards collaborative and cooperative management. Now, the great question as we look to the future is, will there be any change as far as implementation is concerned? Will these countries that act collectively in the context of the Arctic Council then begin to be able to take their deliberations back and implement them within the sovereign authority of their countries? And that is an uncertain question at this point. Will there, beyond that, then be some process of accountability back to the Arctic Council for how the countries have actually done in implementing these recommendations? But the next meeting, as I've said, is the ministerial in May. I understand that it's on Secretary Kerry's calendar. He's a busy man these days. We'll see. But that's very important. So that's the process. Clearly, something new is evolving in the Arctic that has the potential to be a new approach to governance in the international arena across a range of types of geography from a political perspective that are shared by a number of countries. It's going to be very interesting to see how that evolves. I sort of would leave you with three, maybe, I think there's lots of interesting nuances to all of this, but perhaps three or four thoughts. One is, one of the things that's happening very interesting is all of this is stimulating, just as the governments are being stimulated, civil society is being stimulated, including economic sectors. So we have seen over the last year, through the IUCN process and cooperation with NGOs, we're involved, and economic forces, an effort beginning to be created to try to look at critical principles to assure sustainable development of the Arctic, particularly where impacts, effects, needs of different sectors begin to intersect. So you've got a sort of that civil society process beginning to happen. Just last week here in Washington, the president of Iceland announced a new process called the Arctic Circle, along with a number of other people, including Alice Rogoff, who's had a long interest in the Arctic, particularly in Alaska. But this process, again, is designed to bring other players than just governments, but maybe including some non-Arctic governments, such as China, into a process that would begin to elaborate and think about this same set of issues. So what is happening is there's if I can include economic forces within the concept of civil society, there's beginning to become a citizenry, if you will, or a constituency, or a set of parties who actually are focusing some level of attention and interest on not exclusively their self-interest, but a collective interest in the evolution and management of the Arctic. A second factor that's very interesting is the question about the security interests in the Arctic. Much has been made of the Russian planting of the Russian aluminum flag on the floor of the sea at the North Pole. Mr. Chillingaroth, who did that, is a very skilled showman, and that certainly got everybody's attention. And it sort of, I think, distorted the discussion for a while as to whether there was going to be, as there was this rush for economic resources, going to be some sort of political conflict and maybe even security challenges. And there's been much discussion of that, and we've shared some of that with CSIS, and it's been a useful discussion. My own view is that to the extent that there are territorial claims, or to the extent that the extended continental shelf is uncertain, particularly the law of the sea poses a framework within which all of those get resolved in an orderly fashion. Of course, we aren't party to the law of the sea. One would hope that perhaps the economic opportunities in the Arctic might change the dynamics of that in the Senate. But there is an orderly process for territorial claims. But it's clear that there's going to be a lot more stuff going on in the Arctic. And when that happens, societies tend to have an interest to try to make sure that they know what's going on. There's some level of management of that process, which at some level does involve the capacity to have military presence. And just as NSF desires to have scientific domain awareness, the Department of Defense desires to have militarily oriented domain awareness in the Arctic that might be greater than would have been the case. But this is not anything new, particularly in the world's oceans, where for thousands, if not hundreds of years, nations have both in cooperation and not in cooperation attempted to make sure there was orderly utilization of the resources of the marine environment. So this will be an evolving situation, but I think, again, an interesting one, and one which, again, stimulates this need to have cooperation, collaboration, and accountability for successful governance among the Arctic countries. The final thing I would say is that what we may be looking at here is the evolution of a new way of cooperating among governments to manage global or regional environmental problems. We clearly have maybe gone beyond the classical treaty-based system, came out of sovereign states as defined in the 19th century, and there may be emerging in the Arctic a new basis, non-treaty based, more inclusive of civil society and economic society, perhaps much more reliant on and involving modern technology and all of the capacities that it has for analysis and participation and decision-making and accountability and reporting. So there's a very interesting evolution that might happen in the Arctic, not just for the Arctic, but for global society. So those of you who might get to participate in the college, study some of these, and then go on to work on these emerging problems, it could be very exciting. Thank you.
Bill, thank you. Oh, yes, please. Thank you. Wonderful. Well, many thanks, Kelly, Andreas, and Bill. Really different dimensions of the Arctic. I think that certainly underline the complexity of it. If I may take the moderator's prerogative and ask each of you 3 short questions, I promise, and then really we want to open up for discussion. We have plenty of time for some great questions. Kelly, I was really, thank you for raising the questions of logistics and the cost of logistics. And the cost of infrastructure, and certainly not only fuel came to my mind, but icebreakers, that we rely on outsourcing that to some extent from other countries. We have one medium strengthened icebreaker now. The Polar Star is back online a bit. You know, really speaking to, if we want to pursue a rigorous science agenda, do we have the necessary capabilities and budget to implement that? That would be one question. And then the second question, you know, you mentioned the complexity of coordination, and I am struck as I study U.S. Arctic policy, it's extraordinarily complex. I mean, just, coordinating 14 agencies with science engaged in it. Well, there are over 20 plus federal agencies, and what this new report to the president recommends is they add one more sort of overarching coordinating structure. We tend to answer our coordination problems by adding one more council to coordinate the complexity. Is it time for a rethink on coordination? Just from your experience from the science agenda, I would welcome, your thoughts on how do you work through that complexity. It's one thing to prioritize, it's another thing to implement, and how do we go about that? Andreas, my question for you is the EU wants to become a permanent observer to the Arctic Council. 3 members of the Arctic Council are EU members, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. And in some ways, the EU has justified this. They spend the science, the research, the funding. They have maritime interests. They are a huge consumer of fisheries. But play a hypothetical. What happens if the EU does not become a permanent observer next month? The Canadian government is certainly not supportive necessarily of the EU's membership. So I just welcome sort of what happens the day after, if in fact the EU is not granted permanent observer status. And Bill, your question, governance speed. While I think the Arctic Council has done enormous work over the last 4 years, truly coming of age, evolving, in diplomatic terms, probably the most rapid development we've seen. But one thing that has been urgently needed in the Arctic, this mandatory polar code, has been moving. I mean, glaciers have been moving faster than the IMO. And this is a really important issue to place on the table, yet we can't quite get there. Sort of help me understand, how can we capture this movement and accelerate it? And then I guess maybe this is both a Kelly and a Bill question. It seems to me the Arctic Council does great work, but it doesn't really strongly influence the policy making. Wonderful assessments, strong studies, but it is the implementation. Is how do governments then take this information and change their policies or change their approach? I don't see evidence of that, and I think that's really where we need to take governance. So that's your pop quiz after that presentation. Kelly, go right ahead.
With the icebreaker, you asked the $1 billion question, right? Well, I would just like to say that the Healy, which is a pretty science-capable icebreaker, is in play. It's due for a midlife refit in 2015, roughly. I think I saw my Coast Guard comrade come in the room. There we are, over there. So we will look forward to another at least 15 years of life in the Healy after that. And that's been used by lots of agencies. So that's a good success. The Star is just undergone its sea trials, and we do expect to use it in Antarctica in the coming season. So hopefully the Star will be around to help out as well. We've actually had a river launch of the Sikuliak, which is a light icebreaker, and it's going to be home ported in Seward, Alaska, and working that region. We retired a ship called the Alpha Helix, which was really long in the tooth. But it's being built at Marinette, Wisconsin. It'll sail out through the locks and be doing science in 2014. So looking ahead, looking further down the road, we are engaged right now in a process with the Coast Guard, as are other agencies across government, to try and scope out and think about new icebreakers. And we are currently involved in a concept of operations phase, where we're thinking about how it would be used and how the different agencies could benefit from it. I would like to say that I think when people say it's becoming more benign, and I appreciate my colleague's comment that, well, with bad weather it might actually not be benign, that it's easy sitting back in an armchair saying, well, you're not got any ice up there, so why do you need a breaker? But in fact, unconsolidated sea ice, which we're going to see for a very long time, blown around by storms and heavy waves, is extremely dangerous. And to build ships without those conditions in mind would be foolhardy. That said, from the science community standpoint, we're hoping we get the most efficient breaker possible going forward from a new icebreaker perspective, and that could help escort our very science-capable vessels into the field when we need to do that as one approach. The one other thing I want to say is that we also collaborate very effectively with our Canadian and European partners. That becomes very important when you consider the expense of mobilizing from one side of the Arctic to the other. Europeans are looking at pooling their assets in order to cover the growing operations and maintenance costs, and have invited us to the table to consider whether we want to be part of the pool to use ships like the Odin and the Polarstern in the Arctic setting. So we like to keep all of our options open for our investigators, and we want to do this in the most cost-effective way possible. So that's an NSF perspective on the ship story.
You want to talk about the coordination?
In terms of coordinating within government, that was your question. So you mentioned that we're working on an Arctic strategy for the nation. We've been at the table in that process, and I'm hopeful that we're going to come out with a document that moves us forward. What really will move us forward is the follow-on to that, where we move into potentially an executive order that lays out very clearly who's going to do what and when. So we're very keen on being accountable for implementation. This particular document that I was waving around that coordinates research is now entered the implementation phase, and we're pushing hard to make it accountable.
Thank you. My wife's British, and she would advise me not to answer a question that is hypothetical. Do you believe that there will be no acceptance of the European application? Okay. It wouldn't be the first time that Europe's application is rejected. Last time, and I think that's an indication of what will happen next time, or would happen if there is a next time, is that Europe would prepare to try again. Europe would stay calm and carry on, as one does, under those circumstances. And in the staying calm and carrying on, I think it would continue to build involvement in Arctic issues and build credibility, knowing that eventually that the power of seduction would be great enough to earn a seat at the table. It would definitely continue to work towards the alignment of the member states' positions and policies in that area, because that is something that overarchingly Europe needs to do in all areas of international relations at this time. It would move issues that it cares about and that it can't move forward in the Arctic Council into other fora wherever the opportunities arise. And that will lead to clashes between the European External Action Service and the foreign services of the Arctic countries that are member states. But in the end, in those conflicts, the European Union will always prevail. That is the essence of the Lisbon Treaty, that is reallocating responsibilities more towards the center, and over time practice will follow. And the last aspect, which is I think important, is we conducted the Arctic footprint assessment, policy assessment and footprint analysis for the European Commission, and it was the first time that somebody attempted to use the footprinting methodology to understand what impact one region, the European Union, has on another region, and what explains and what determines that impact, which policies can change in order to improve that impact, avoid the negative aspects and improve the positive aspects. So the European Union has a lot of possibilities of changing, reforming domestic policies in order to have minimize the negative impact, chemical pollution, black carbon or whatever, resource depletion on the Arctic, but also try and develop policies in such a way that they have a beneficial effect on, for example, social policy aspects in Arctic regions, to the extent that domestic policies in the European Union can do that. This is a different way of framing the issue of what is a European Arctic policy, and that is also changing domestic policies in order to improve the impact the European Union has on the Arctic. And I think it would be interesting to see other regions of the world, other countries, to do a similar analysis to understand why and how they're responsible for the changes in the Arctic and what they can do about that. Thank you.
Polar code, that's a good example of the failures of the past. There has been a voluntary polar code. There was a very good assessment of enhancing and strengthening the safety of shipping in the Arctic, done by a working group of the Arctic Council, led by Lawson Brigham of the U.S., and that then has turned into efforts to strengthen the regulation of shipping in the Arctic. But that's not something the countries do, and that's not something the Arctic Council does. That's something that the International Maritime Organization does, which is, I'm not an expert, but I gather notoriously slow. But that should not be an adequate end of the story. At the last ministerial, the ministers admonished the IMO to do more. I've seen the draft of the statement for the next ministerial. Virtually the same language appears, but I doubt that language will change things any. So I think that process has to become, and this is my view, has to receive a higher level of political awareness and engagement for success to be achieved. And I think that probably can happen in at least 3 or 4 areas. One is that the advocacy community for these issues spends very little time in the various key national capitals getting political attention raised to these levels, to these issues, at a higher level than the working level of the IMO. So that has to change. Secondly, I think that, in fact, as the interest in accessing the Arctic grows, whether it's countries that want to be in the Arctic more, such as China, or businesses that will be in the Arctic, I think there will be an evolving pressure for action to be taken at the IMO, because as we see the potentials for accidents, no one's going to want to be responsible for what could very easily happen this summer. I've sailed on one ship that hit a rock, and luckily no one was lost, but that ship isn't going to the Arctic anymore. So I think that, and this growing movement generally for a more effective civil society is part of that process. And the final dimension, and this is where I become, really try to put on my my advocacy hat as a member of an environmental NGO. I'd like to see, if we can't get the IMO to act, a few countries that control critical straits, such as Russia and the United States, begin to explore ways where they could more effectively, through control in those areas, even though I understand all the principles of shipping and all of that, begin to exercise authority that essentially challenges the failure of the IMO to act. Now that would be an I've just begun to think about that, so I don't quite know whether it makes any sense or what the areas would be, but we just can't sit around with committees of the IMO meeting year after year after year. And I sent an email to my colleagues, and I said, how can we speed up the IMO, my colleagues that work there? And they said, oh, well, that's just the way it is. Well, that's not the way we should be. On the implementation issue, generally, I mean, there has to be implementation. That has been a failure. We're beginning to see some commitments to do things by the governments at the council ministerial level. So they now are beginning to assume some implementation responsibility. And so there will be a accountability, transparency, reporting back kind of process, and we test over a couple of years whether or not this works. And if it doesn't, That then raises the interesting question as to whether the Arctic Council, Arctic countries are seen by the world to be effectively exercising their responsibilities for shared, collaborative, effective management. And if they don't, what are the remedies for that?
All right, this side of the table has talked way too much. Now we need to turn it to your side of the table. What I'd love to do is bundle a couple of questions, please, and then have our colleagues go. How about we just go right around the table, sir? We'll start with you, and Caitlin will just move around into Ken.
Bill made reference to the Arctic Council, or the black carbon issue, where is an area where the Arctic Council is active. The excellent report in 2011. I mean, it tends to show a lot of the black carbon essentially coming from forest fire and grassland burning in Eurasia, which of course is fairly difficult. I mean, the practical ways of dealing with it, but also that in terms of the Arctic Circle areas, that is a huge contributor. In terms of Greenland, the Greenland melting, really North America, probably diesel emissions, some forest fire emissions from Canada, diesel emissions from the U.S. and Canada playing a large role. Actions are underway in the diesel sector just for, essentially for non-climate reasons there. But there are two areas of really very large, growth recently that perhaps are opportunity areas, and I like the panel's sense for, how that might be addressed. One, Professor Jacobson at Stanford did an excellent study published a few months ago on Arctic air overflights. Really since '98, that's been a huge factor since the Russians essentially permitted the overflights, and you have something like 40-some thousand a year. In some cases, the black carbon in the stratosphere has like 500,000 times multiplier, 1 ton of black carbon of CO2. I mean, the impacts are particularly huge because it resides well in the stratosphere. Rerouting of flights could be accomplished at very modest economic costs, although there might be some time costs associated with it. A second area that right now is not yet a large source, but very likely will be a much larger source in the future, would be oil and gas and some mineral development, where if it were possible, for example, to the extent that that's going to be going ahead, to essentially get the various oil and gas and mineral companies to go to virtually a zero black carbon standard and effectively almost a zero methane release standard. That might be one way of making a huge impact at very low cost in terms of both tropical ozone and black carbon. But I wondered what approaches you might think would be effective. Their multilateral within the Arctic Council or whatever for that.
2 points. First, Bill got me thinking that I'd feel more comfortable with the EU, with Asian countries being permanent observers, if they could add their strength to the activities of pushing the polar code through. More countries in the IMO favoring it means at least it has a chance of going faster. That there are a number of things in the Arctic that cannot be done by the Arctic 8 countries. But there are a number of things that are solely their province. But the outside membership, the observers, have that role to help things move forward, and in sheer numbers add a lot more to that basic 8. But second, fair is fair, so I have a question for Heather. Yeah. In all the work I've done in both national and international governance, it's come clear to me that you need 3 types of leadership. You need people who understand the issue and who can say what interests are and what courses of action can be taken. You need procedural leaders who can lead you through building those options and developing consensus. But neither of those are sufficient without inspirational leadership that speaks to both of those processes. In the U.S., we are great on that procedural part. We just don't know where we're going with it. We have all the substantive skill, but I look at both our ocean policy and Arctic policy, and I see a great bureaucratic exercise. I do think and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, that we need more participation and opportunities for leadership for our people who live and work in the Arctic. Washington, D.C. is not exactly the place to get that inspiration. So the comment on the role of the EU and other observers in making movement in these non-Arctic or global institutions, and what can we do to give the United States that inspirational view of the Arctic beyond our obvious skills in procedural leadership? I don't know who's next.
Excellent panel. I just wanted to ask Andreas two questions. I'm fascinated as a former, political type in the EU processes, that you described. My question is, several of the EU countries already have Arctic ambassadors and Arctic policies, that have been written and articulated. How are these going to be melded together? Are countries going to cease doing this? Sort of how is it going to work, to meld these activities? And is it foreseen that there would be an EU Arctic ambassador at some point? The second question I have is on the summer college, which I think sounds terrific. But I'm wondering, is there any relationship to the University of the Arctic at all in what you're describing? Again, a virtual university, a different type of situation, but I'm wondering if there are going to be any linkages.
Great. Okay, why don't we pause there and answer all those good questions. Kelly, do you want to talk a little bit about the black carbon question and some of the science-related issues behind that? We'll start off there, and I'll let Andreas and Bill.
So black carbon is clearly something that we've identified to have a number of research gaps. There are lots of interesting potential implications people have identified, but the predicted outcomes from actions are controversial from a research perspective. So for example, you mentioned that it warms the atmosphere, which is indeed true. The other thing people will invoke is that once it hits the snow surface in the Arctic, it has that additional warming or albedo effect. Interestingly enough, the research community has looked at this distribution of black carbon in the surfaces in the Arctic 20 plus years ago, and then more recently didn't see any difference between the two, and came to the conclusion, although I think this needs further work, that that couldn't be the source of accelerated sea ice loss because there weren't differences. There were not measurable differences over that time frame. It really actually raises a whole lot more questions. Was it the appropriate time frame? What effects are we looking at? But it's clearly an important area of research. I think the studies that the Arctic Council have endorsed state this, and I think it's incumbent on us to accelerate the pace of research in that domain. So I completely agree with pointing it out as an important issue. It is in this plan. I'm not convinced we've done enough to actually be explicit about how we can coordinate with each other to make sure those gaps are filled in a short order. Because I hear people trying to march off on policy on this issue already, and I'm not convinced we're marching on solid ground on our understanding.
Andreas, any comment on the black carbon?
No, I don't have comments on the black carbon. I find it difficult to imagine that there would be agreement on rerouting of Arctic overflights at this point. It may happen one day, but at the moment I don't see it. I have the two questions that Ken asked. Again, a hypothetical question, sort of how will this happen? What you see is, on the one hand, an emerging European diplomacy that is trying to claim ground in thematic areas and geographies, and is trying to build up structures by eroding the structures, the diplomacies, the diplomatic services of the member states, which is really working by people being shifted from the capitals of the member states towards the common service, European service within Europe. So it's a way of transferring human resources. It's a process of transferring legal competences. But the existing structures in the capitals of the member states, they're not going to give up without a fight. They're going to claim the same themes. They're going to claim the same territories. They're going to use the ability that they can quickly declare climate ambassadors or Arctic ambassadors in order to claim space, claim visibility. It's asymmetrical. Some of the member states have reasons to be Arctic nations because they are in the Arctic, or they have territory that they control that is in the Arctic. If Iceland joins the European Union, that again will be another player in the Arctic realm that has unquestionable competence and is affected directly whatever happens. Some of the southern member states, some of the landlocked member states that don't even have maritime interests, they don't care that much, and it's that asymmetry that allows the European Union to, on the one hand, claim more space, because some of the member states say, well, why should we invest in this? It's better to coordinate this and do it at the European level. While others with strong diplomacies and strong interests in the region may resist it. That tug of war will continue for, I predict, 2 generations, perhaps not in the Arctic, but overall, that is how long it is going to take. On the Arctic Summer College and the University of the Arctic, there is no specific relationship with the University of the Arctic. We have debated whether to have an academic partner as a specific type of an institutional partner, with the view of organizing the college in such a way that participants who participate every time and who do something like submit a paper or something like that that has a good enough quality, that can be graded, that they could earn a credit that could then be recognized by university and like that make it more attractive. It's A, difficult to organize, and B, it changes the attraction. It then attracts a completely different pool of applicants, of candidates into this, because suddenly you get the students who need the credits. And we really want to have the doctoral students and the postdocs, and we want to have mid-career professionals with a practical experience that come in, and we would change the culture and the color of this Arctic Summer College if we went down that road. So it's an open question, but for the time being, we've said we're going to do it without formalized academic partners.
Thanks, Andreas.
Bill, do you want a couple of questions thrown your way? We can wrap up.
Well, just on the black carbon issue, I mean, I'm not an expert on that. My colleague Brooks Yeager and Erica Rosenthal, Earth Justice, work on it quite a bit. And I think they would completely agree that there's a discrimination between very hard things to do, very distant things to do, and then very easier things to do and maybe closer. So that's a useful way of thinking about it. And then I think there are things to do that even given the scientific uncertainty are sort of no regrets. I mean, they would be good things to do anyway. So that's about as far as I can go. I'm happy to have, if anyone wants to follow up further, get contacts from Brooks, works in this area. You know, the question about political and inspirational leadership, I mean, again, the interesting thing is we get this richer broth of interests. Whether that will emerge or stimulate that kind of leadership will be interesting to see.
Dick, well, I'll give you the last question and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you, Heather. As you know, I'm not an expert on this subject, but I do have a follow-on question on the black carbon. There was a series of articles in the National Geographic a year or two ago dealing with this subject, and they identified, you know, these great big pools of black goop that was collecting inside which was collecting inside of the glaciers as it would gradually melt and concentrate, and it was just cutting through those glaciers apparently. When they did a chemical analysis of that black goop, what was it? Where did it come from? So that would be my first question. The second question is, over time, this brown cloud from Asia, both coming from China and across the Pacific and coming north from India into the Himalayas, is obviously producing soot. This soot falls somewhere. When it falls on an ocean, well, maybe you've got an acid issue there, But when it falls on ice, then the ice melts, it gets more concentrated. Ice melts more, it gets more concentrated. And I'm just wondering, what is the consensus of view on that subject as partial cause of this of the ice melt? What is the consensus in the scientific community?
There is a very good study. I don't know if you recall that there was a lot of controversy about overstating the contribution of global warming to water problems in the Himalaya. And then the National Academy took another look at that following the release of the IPCC report. And what they found was, in fact, what you pointed out is one of the more important factors, is that on the eastern side of the Himalaya, which is in fact experiencing that ice melt, that black carbon effect is an important contributor to it, and indeed is coming from, burning stoves and whatnot in India. And the other portion is actually in a mass balance and is affected by a different weather pattern, a monsoonal one. I'm not acquainted with the black goop study, so I'm not sure what to say about that per se, but I know in general when people filter out that colored material, somewhere on the order, out on the sea ice cover anyway, somewhere in the order of about 30% of it is actual black carbon. Another 30% is brown material, colored material that similarly results from, either fossil fuel burning or other burning, forest fires and so forth. And they all play a role in the albedo effect in terms of the warming. And then there are mysterious things, and they vary from place to place as exactly what they are. But I think down the row here, we had the suggestion that we should go ahead and reduce black carbon if we can. There are health reasons for that, and I will not want to underplay that. Wherever we can address that, it's important to do so. My understanding at this point is that that unless the whole globe gets on the short-lived climate forcer tack right now, we're not going to do a whole lot. There's a paper that just came out this last week in Nature Climate Science, and it was a modeling study. And it looked at if you were able to ramp back over the next 100 years on the short-lived climate forces, what does that buy you in terms of warming or reduced warming? And they came to the conclusion that you could reduce the rate of sea level rise by over half if you just address the short-lived climate forcers. So, but that was taking a global look at that problem, not an Arctic-specific one. So.
Dick, you make me want to look up black goop, so you've given me a task afterwards. Well, we are past our time. Let me just begin by thanking Ecologic for co-hosting this event. Happy 50th birthday, Andreas, and to the team that is assembled here. I'll end on Caitlin's note about needing that leadership and that vision. It's not just from the U.S. It needs to come, obviously, from the U.S. of what our vision is for the Arctic, but it is a global leadership issue, and I think that's what's lacking. Hopefully, though, many in this room, and what I'm hoping with the Arctic Summer College, we need to grow the next generation of leaders who look at this issue through an interdisciplinary approach, from security, environment, economics, and whatever we can do to nurture that next group of the next leaders who will take on after us and be facing daunting challenges, how we grow those. So it's a wonderful partnership, and please join me in thanking Dr. Kelly Falkner, Andreas Kraemer, and Bill Eichbaum for their presentations. Thank you.